why is it important for us to have flexible thinking, and then hat tip to your book, flexible dieting, when it comes to nutrition and creating or recomping or optimizing for the body composition that we want?
Well, I think that life is just generally a jungle, and we have to be flexible just in general, just to deal with life. And it doesn't really make sense to think that we can achieve dietary perfection or optimization all the time. And beyond that, I think that everybody is so different in their preferences and tolerances and goals. And not only that, but outside of some very specific performance stuff and some high end type of body composition goals, the body is super resilient in terms of what you can throw at it and still live a healthy life dietarily. And by resilient and flexible, I also mean the body. There's a very wide range of possible macronutrient breakdowns that the body will just equally handle depending on the goal, both health wise and sometimes even performance wise. And there's also a wide range of food selection, food choices that will enable people to live just ripe, long lives, even if they have completely different sets of foods that they enjoy. So the human organism is amazingly diverse and resilient and capable of just almost surviving and thriving on not everything, but on a very wide range of foods. There are certain things that are less negotiable than others, but we'll get there. So, well, that's my first winding answer.
I love that. And I think that I can hear the collective sigh across all the listeners, because there's so much permission in that, because we don't need to be thinking in terms of black or white. There can be many shades of gray here. So just to highlight this, talk a little bit about what flexible dieting is, and we'll make sure that there's a show links in the show notes for your book, which is available on Amazon, at least last time I checked, and really everywhere. But what is flexible dieting?
Sure. Flexible dieting is it's something that is widely misunderstood and misinterpreted and misrepresented. First of all, that's what that's what I think flexible dieting is. Flexible dieting is often synonymous with macro counting, or counting your macronutrient grams. And that is not what flexible dieting is. Counting macros is a type of dieting. And people have conflated counting macros with an acronym called IIFYM, like if it fits your macros.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then what folks have done to take things a step further is conflate if it fits your macros with flexible dieting. And so that's the part that's incorrect. And I don't expect everybody to know that. And that's why I wrote a book about it. And so flexible dieting is, the origins of it are in psychology. So it goes back to 1975-ish, when the concept of cognitive styles of restraint were discussed. So fast forward to the 90s, and now we're talking about cognitive styles of dietary restraint. And so there's rigid dietary restraint and flexible dietary restraint, where rigid dietary restraint views foods and dieting as all or nothing, black or white. And the flexible side of things sees dieting and foods in shades of gray. And so flexible dieting, as we kind of fast forward to the present, is that idea too, a cognitive style of dietary restraint, but also flexibility of dietary approach in terms of how you execute it. Are you more of a quantitative micromanaging person who likes being kind of an accountant with your macronutrients and your spreadsheets and all of that? Or are you more habits-based, qualitative, you don't want to bother with the small details type of person, you just want to live your life with some guidelines? We have everybody from all points in that spectrum. And so flexible dieting would say, hey, whatever approach that you want to take is the approach that you should be taking because you prefer it and can sustain it. So it's really, how do we individualize the dietary approach? How do we individualize macronutrition? How do we individualize food selection? How do we individualize hedonic allotment, or the junk foods, the fun foods, the indulgence food allotment? And how do we individualize the dieting process to suit someone's proclivity for more of a linear daily caloric restriction type of model, or more of a cyclical dieting or an intermittent energy intake type of model? All of those things need to be individualized. And so going back to the question, like, what is flexible dieting? I would say flexible dieting is really individualizing everything as much as possible so the person can sustain it. And there are wide variations across individuals in all of those aspects that I mentioned that work.
It's been my observation that the more specific the prescription, the more useless it is. So sometimes you'll hear, and I say that sort of tongue in cheek a little bit, because sometimes you'll hear, doesn't matter who, someone online saying something like, you should never, do you know celery? There was a study that looked at celery, and celery is a goitrogen and it has these anti-thyroid, let's say, like whatever it is, there's some little piece of this vegetable that if you consume it, you're going to have a goiter and your thyroid's not going to work. And of course, the amount of celery that you would need to consume in this silly example would be, you wouldn't be able to consume the amount of celery in order to be able to affect those changes in the body. But someone who maybe is not as well read as yourself, who's just sort of looking for the how, like they don't want to know the why and the what, it's just what's the how and what's the now. They'll hear someone say, celery is bad for my thyroid, so I'm not going to have celery. And so I bring that up because I think that there is a lot of there is a lot of black and white type of thinking in the nutrition space. And I think that over time, even my own views, I would say, have softened. So we'll talk about intermittent fasting. I used to be like team IF, like it was like every quarter I am going to be fasting for several days, until I started messing up my menstrual cycle, which maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't today, but it's very individualized. So I think that the more specific that my long winding preamble here is, the more specific the recommendation seems to be, the more useless it seems to be as well. So I do like more of a broader, and this is where you kind of get into the expert space. You'll often, if you pay attention to language, which I'm very sensitive to, you'll often hear experts use words like can, maybe, or the illustrative, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that, versus feeling forced in a way to be able to provide an answer that fits with the paradigm or the schema that they have set for themselves.
Yes, definitely. And it's like when you think of being in private practice and working with clients or patients, the whole concept of having a really specific kind of script, a singular, narrow script that you give everybody. I mean, that you're not going to be in practice for very long, right?
Right.
Like, so just kind of coming from a background of having been in private practice for so many years, it really does kind of blow my mind that somebody could say, okay, I am the keto nutritionist, or I am the blank, whatever you want to brand yourself with, a very specific type of diet. You cannot individualize things optimally if you just kind of stick in this very narrow and specific type of role or type of brand. It just doesn't make sense to me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.